Right, welcome to Lecture 11 and welcome to the Anthropocene. First up, some people say Anthropocene, some people say Anthropocene, both are fine, don't worry. So, in the arts section of this course, what we're talking about is, in particular, is shifting fields of perception. Okay? And what I'm particularly interested is the relationship between biological evolution, technological evolution, and the evolution of fields of perception. Okay? So you've got three large moving fronts, if you like. And so those different forms of evolution are not always aligned, but they impact each other powerfully. And so the Anthropocene offers us, I think, a very material case study of the impact of technology on our perception and the concomitant impact of those perceptions on public awareness, specifically on public awareness of the scale and variety of human impacts on the biology, the geology, and the chemistry of the Earth. So that's at the heart of today's class. And I want to start with a tectonic shift in the fields of perception that began with the image of the Earthrise. Oops, hang on. Just go back to that.
2 days before Christmas in 1968, astronauts Borman, Lovell, and Andrews became the first humans to pass out of Earth's gravitational control and into that of another body in the solar system, the Moon.
Everything in the NASA mission is completely planned out, right down to where to be and where to be. And here was this moment. No one had anticipated the emotional power of the Earthrise.
Oh, yeah, look at that picture over there. Earth from us. Wow, that's pretty. Okay, I'll take that. I'll schedule. You got a color film, Jim? Give me a roll of color film. Oh, yeah, looks like we're quick.
And they were starting to the camera, like, where's their film here? Who got it? And there was even a debate about who took the picture because it was so hurried.
Let's go. Here. Look at it like that.
Okay. So I want you to reflect a little bit on why you think this unprecedented image of Earth, this image of Earthrise, had such a powerful emotional and ultimately political effect. And I just want you to congregate briefly in groups of three, elect a scribe, and write down your thoughts about how we can best understand why this image had such an impact. Okay, so just take a couple of minutes to do that, and then we'll pool some of your responses. And it's useful to think both about the historical moment and the image itself. Okay. Right. Let's pool some of those responses. Sorry? Yeah, it's okay. Yep. Okay. Let's pull some of those responses. It doesn't seem to be working.
Sound is not working.
Yeah? That's working. I don't think this is working. Right. Does any one of the scribes want to volunteer, kick off responses? Yeah. And we have a roving mic.
The fact that you chose this image in the slide, because the uncropped version has like the moon on it.
Yes.
And for that, so I've loved this image for many years. It always feels like you're standing on the moon and looking at the Earth from a distance. So we kind of discussed how it gives human perspective. And my new friend, she said.
Good.
What she did was the globe of the planet Earth is the cartoon version, where you see continents, and someone drew it. But here you can't really see. It's just like blue and some clouds, and it's like what it actually looks like.
Right. Okay. So that's a really good platform to work with. So in the original image, in the emerging image of Earthrise, you have the pocked surface of the moon and the sense that you're standing on the moon looking at this, okay? So it's a completely radical and unprecedented perspective. And here you don't get the textured detail of the planet, but you just get the kind of marble, the image of that. Yeah, any other responses? Yeah. Do we have a... So in the red shirt. Okay.
So we were talking a bit about how, for us growing up in the 21st century, we've seen pictures like this sort of from afar kind of our whole lives, so it doesn't necessarily carry as much emotional weight.
Mm-hmm.
But for astronauts back in the 60s or 70s,
Late 60s.
who had never seen a picture like this before, just kind of the gravity seeing every nation on Earth, every person they've ever known, everywhere they'll ever be, kind of all in one insignificant speck in the sky, so an radical perspective shift.
Yeah, okay, so that's great. So the idea of everyone and everything, the idea of a totality, a totalizing image was unprecedented. And also the sense of, to use your word, the speck. What is the significance of the speck, of the planetary speck, if you like? Yeah. Okay.
And how looking at it from a distance, you see that we're actually very insignificant and our existence is very fragile. I think that in a sense, the fact that so much is uncertain in terms of how we might be impacted, right? Even that pressure us and how uncertain all of this is. I think being able to see that, knowing that that's your home and that's all it is, kind of puts into perspective, I think, global issues that we might be facing, and think of how it's kind of reminded me of a Pale Blue Dot by Sagan,
Yeah.
And I was thinking, when he talks about how political struggles with power and world wars and all of these things that we fight over our planet, it's
Right.
That's all we are.
Yeah.
And that one tract of land makes absolutely no difference when you look at it from that distance.
Right. Okay. So that with the distance comes this idea of insignificance, and then the other idea that you mentioned fragility, vulnerability. Okay, and so this image played a big role in the shift in public perceptions about the globe as huge, expansive. Suddenly it shrunk to the speck, to this vulnerable speck, and you're beginning to get in the 60s a rising awareness of environmental fragility on a scale that was not previously there. Okay? So particularly in the post-war period, which we'll be talking about with the Anthropocene, there was a surge of optimism around technology's capacity to deliver growth, to deliver progress across a broad front. Okay? So, any other points people wanted to raise about that? So there's an aesthetic dimension as well of the blue planet against this black backdrop of blackness, the sense of isolation, fragility, and totality all in one. Now, this image was taken in December 1968. I don't know if there are any history majors here. What was happening in the US in 1968?
Assassination. Protest. Vietnam.
Okay, Vietnam protest assassination. That was quick. Okay, so you've got the assassination of Martin Luther King, the assassination of Robert Kennedy Jr. You've got the height of the Vietnam War, or as they say in Vietnam, the American War. And you've also got the violent clashes at the Democratic convention in Chicago between the police and anti-war protesters. Okay, so it was a very, very dark and volatile year when the society was even more divided than it is today in many ways. And so there was, in the last month of that year, there was so much attention paid to this image of unity, the fact that the planet is shared, the fact that we are all on it and in it in some sense together. And so this was picked up and mobilized. And so you had the Whole Earth Catalog, you had Earth Day in 1970, just a few years later. You had the surge of legislation, some of which, as we know, is being picked apart at the moment. But the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, the Endangered Species Acts, these were all things that were coming in the early 70s. And one of the catalysts was the shift in public sentiment and mobilization coming from the Earthrise image. Other currents included the Santa Barbara oil spill in 1969, the Cuyahoga River catching alight. So there was this great awareness of toxicity and danger there. And then also the shifting perspectives on technology and agribusiness coming particularly out of Rachel Carson and Silent Spring. So all these different cultural currents were coming together, changing perception and helping shift national policy in terms of environmental protection. So it really did result in an upsurge in an awareness of the need to protect the earth and an awareness of almost an idealism in relation to reaching out across boundaries to create a better protected environment. So here's another image of the blue planet, and it's an image based on Anthony Bonovsky's comment, "We are the asteroid." So the idea here of two big chunks, one, the planet, a unitary planet, the other, humanity as a hurtling chunk of rock. Okay? So what he's trying to get at here is the idea that for the first time in the history of the planet, you have a sentient species, namely Homo sapiens, that is having an impact on Earth's life systems equivalent to an asteroid strike. Okay? So the Anthropocene hypothesis, or the Anthropocene paradigm, is this idea that our collective effects on life systems, on biology, geology, and chemistry, our collective effect on that has tipped us out of the Holocene, the relatively stable protective envelope of the Holocene in which human civilizations developed, tipped us out of the Holocene and into a whole new epoch, the Anthropocene. Okay? So not since the great oxidation event catalyzed by the cyanobacteria 2.5 billion years ago have there been life forms that have had such an impact on the planet as humanity. And what is different this time around, they argue, is that Homo sapiens is sentient and therefore has consciousness, has ethics, has technology, and how are we going to respond to this awareness that we have changed the carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle, the water cycle, radically impacted the cryosphere, intentionally and unintentionally move species around at such a rate that those movements will be legible in the fossil record. And the fact that through industrial agriculture, we now something like 90% of the mass of vertebrate life on the planet is constituted by our agricultural animals, by cattle, sheep, pigs, chickens, goats, and humanity itself. So only 10% by mass of vertebrate life is actually wild creatures. So these are all massive shifts that can be read in some cases down into the chemistry of Earth itself. Okay? So if we look back at the second half of the 20th century, the great fear at a planetary scale was that of nuclear war. Okay, and as I mentioned in the first arts lecture, there was a sense in which, through the image of the mushroom cloud, it was much easier to depict that threat as in a spectacular apocalyptic way. Now, with the Anthropocene, the atomic explosions play a very, very different role, because what the Anthropocene is about is it's a kind of reading, a stratigraphic reading of the residues in the Earth layers left by human activities. And one of those catalyzing human activities that is so significant from a geological point of view is the arrival, the advent of unprecedented isotopes resulting from atomic explosions. Isotopes that will be legible, if there are people around to read them, will be legible in the stratigraphic record tens of billions of years from now. Okay, so that's one of the seen as one of the key markers of the Anthropocene. Melting of the ice caps, the rising of the oceans, the remodeling of entire water systems, the changes in the atmosphere, land clearance for large-scale agriculture and ranching, and the sixth extinction, the idea that we have entered a human-induced mass extinction event. So something we won't have time to get into in any detail, but I wanted just to flag the fact that there are a number of different contenders for when the Anthropocene begins. Okay, and these are all debates over what will be legible or readable over the long term in the stratigraphic record. Okay, So there are arguments, some people argue that there are going to be sufficient residues that date back to the beginning of the agricultural revolution, 12 to 15,000 years ago. Some people have argued for the Colombian invasion of the Americas, because through disease and warfare, something like 50 million indigenous people were murdered and died in the Americas, and as a result, there was a massive reforestation, that covered over former indigenous communities, and some people have argued that that is a sufficient marker that will be geologically recognizable. And then the commonest two are James Watt's invention of the steam engine and the impact that had on the creation of steam-driven cotton gins, and the rise in industrialization. Okay, so one pretty prevalent theory dates it back to the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution in the late 18th century, and then followed by a sudden surge of impacts in mid-20th century, starting with the atomic testing. Other people have said the Anthropocene begins in 1945 because these new isotopes are the clearest marker of human impacts. Okay. So there are really two things going on here. One is a set of debates among geologists, among stratigraphers, about what technically would be required to announce the Anthropocene as a whole new epoch, okay? But beyond that, there's a way in which the Anthropocene has entered into public consciousness and has been the center of scores of exhibits and debates and popular culture responses, okay? So in a sense, it's moved out of the hands of the geologist and become part of the larger set of cultural conversations about what does it mean if we realize how significantly and dramatically we have impacted the planet. Okay, so I've talked in the first class a little bit about speculative nonfiction, or what can also be called anticipatory documentary. And I want to think about this from a number of points of view, because the course, as we've suggested, is pitched at 2050. We're thinking towards 2050. With the Anthropocene, we're thinking even further out. We're thinking about what will the geological record look like in 1,000 years, in 10 million years, okay? But they're both very much involved with this perspective, with this future retrospective vantage point. This idea of a future retrospective vantage point, and it poses the question of how does the pressure of that perspective alter our choices, our actions, our behavior. So it's interesting on the campaign trail to see speculative nonfiction in operation. This is Pete Buttigieg. It's in the spirit of future imagination that I stand before you. I often contemplate the year 2054, the year in which I hope to retire at the age our current president is now. We need to reflect the fact that we live in a world that is closer to 2054 than it is to 1945. Okay? So I'm not advocating for any candidate here, I'm just interested in the future imagination. But so clearly he's making a dig at the president's age and the age of some of his competitors. But he's also trying to shift the focus away from the Cold War, the post-World War II era, to the future. He's saying the future has a stronger call on us than the past. Similarly, with Greta Thunberg, she says, in 2078, I will celebrate my birthday. If I have children, maybe they will spend that day with me. Maybe they will ask me about you. Maybe they will ask me why you didn't do anything while there was still time to act. Okay? So you can see how the experience of future imagination, this mix of anticipation and documentation, that it has this retrospective force, can be mobilized to have to generate ethical and political pressure. Okay. So one way of talking about the Anthropocene that we see a lot of is scientists asking what will be the human signature in the fossil record. Okay, what will be legible as the result of human actions as opposed to other actions, non-human actions. Okay, and we hear a lot about the collective carbon footprint and the collective ecological footprint. But it's worth thinking a little bit more about this.
What's the figure of this, or what this working group is doing now, is something very new for the figure. They are not finding evidence about past time, but about our current time. They are not looking for clues or footprints from the past, but they are eyewitnesses of what is going on today. And they can't be found for the They have to be biologists, they have to be ethnographers, they have to be chemists, and even very good.
Right, so two of the things that come out of this are the fact that it has, the idea, the paradigm of the Anthropocene has generated a lot of interdisciplinary conversations, pretty much including all disciplines. As he said, it's not merely a geographical concern, okay? And the idea that he underscores there of looking at the future, at the present, as a set of human residues, as if we are already past, okay? And so it's increasing the investment in future perspective. Okay, so there are advantages and limitations of using the Anthropocene as a frame to think about the relationship between Homo sapiens and the Earth. And I want to focus very much on one of those, which is to do with the idea of the signature, the collective human signature in the fossil record. It is difficult to overestimate the scale and speed of change. In a single lifetime, humanity has become a planetary scale geological force. Okay, this is Will Steffen, who's been an influential figure in this. And so what I think is important to do is to simultaneously think of the species impact, humanity as a whole, but also to disaggregate the species, because different human communities in different places and in different eras have had very unequal impacts. And so one of the things that emerges over the duration of this course is a recognition that the people most exposed to the fallout from those human impacts are very often not the people who have caused the greatest impact. So one response to the Anthropocene, as suggested here by Stuart Brand, is to double down on the ideology of mastery, of earth mastery, of magisterial command. Okay, so there are two very different responses to the Anthropocene. One is to say, we're such an ingenious species, just keep being ingenious and technology will solve our challenges, and we are surrogate divinities who are reorganizing the earth. And the fact that the Anthropocene shows the degree to which we've changed the earth just means we should keep doing the same thing in the future. Okay? Another very different response, which connects more to the blue planet image, is one of if you like, humility and concern. That how can we work to change the rate of these impacts that we're inflicting on the earth, and how can we work with those life systems to stabilize them and protect them rather than to overturn them in the ways that we are, or disturb them in the ways that we are. Elizabeth Colbert, who some of you may know is a very prominent science writer, said two words that probably should not be used in sequence: good and anthropocene. Okay? So she takes a very different vantage point from Stuart Brand, that she's saying, okay, the Anthropocene should be alarming rather than confirming of humans' godlike powers. Okay, this little clip raises the issue I want to focus on for the rest.
Powered by about 20% or slightly less than the U.S. population. That's changing in the 21st century. China's developing, India's developing, Brazil, other countries are developing rapidly, and they're starting their own great acceleration. What's different for them is the resource base. We're hitting peak oil, we may be hitting peak phosphorus, so they're trying to bring their people out of poverty at vastly different rates than the Western countries have in the 1950s and so on.
There's really two human experiences right now on the planet. Approaching the big zoom, this pulse of us, the industrialized us, maybe a billion are already in this mega mode. In the meantime, in the background, you had this other birth of humanity that started out mainly just being a lot of people, but without any real resource intensity, and that's the developing world. So there, even as we're zooming in a sense of how to become more efficient lives, the other big great burst of humanity is just getting in gear, the zoom.
Okay, so this question of resource intensity, unequal histories of resource intensity, is what I want to focus on for the last section of the class. And this is a chart that looks at the upsurge in impacts from around 1950, from the middle of the 20th century. And so we have the rise of industrial agriculture and increased nitrogen use, the rising CO2, we have rising air travel, tourism, habitat clearance, biodiversity loss, and many others. Okay? But we have to think about the unitary story of the Anthropocene in relation to what some people are calling the Great Divide. So this is just one example from the US. From 1989 to 2018, the top 1% of Americans increased their cumulative wealth by an astounding $21 trillion, while the bottom 50% of the country saw their share decrease by $900 billion. Okay? So this idea of the pulling apart of society, and it's happening in most countries in the world, with few exceptions. What you're having is growth without distribution. Okay? And so how do we think about human impacts in the aggregate, but also respect the fact that different communities are drawing down the resources of the planet at very different rates. And they have done so historically, but in the present as well. So this is a chart of the holdings of family wealth, a shift in those holdings in the US, and another chart on the parting of the ways, if you like. And this is in India. So we see some quite similar patterns across different societies. And there's been a surge of books, and this concern with the Great Divide, or what's sometimes called the Great Divergence, this awareness of a convergent humanity's impact on the planet, but the divergence of the scale of those impacts. And if we look at perhaps the most graphic images come from the mega cities around the world. Manila, Nicosia in Cyprus, Rio, Delhi in India. These juxtaposed areas of high impact and low impact, of wealth and abandonment. I just want to pause and talk a little bit about one case study in Lagos, which is a mega city of 21 million in Nigeria, and it focuses on the Lagos Lagoon. Okay, and so what architects came up with was the idea of the Great Wall of Lagos, and this was an elite community that they called Eco-Atlantic with a K. And they got what they call a 100-year sea barrier designed in Denmark, brought in. People were helicoptered over the lagoon into this. And so it became a desirable elite community that supposedly was shielded against the coming impacts of climate change. Okay? But the other side of the lagoon, you've got Makoko, which is an aquatic slum. People living in improvised houseboats. And most of the people there are immigrants from neighboring countries, vulnerable immigrants, who are being kept out. So you've got the seawall that's keeping out the threat of rising seas, but you've also got the wall against poverty. And so I think it's important to hold together these two images and this one lagoon as symptomatic of of the importance, really, of thinking about the Anthropocene as both a species narrative, but also as a narrative about heightened divisions between communities, and with that, a heightened division in terms of planetary impacts. And so we can think here about stratigraphy as a kind of a reading practice, okay? A way of reading the cross-section of the Earth that allows us to read time, okay? And the technologies of detection and perception are advancing all the time, okay? Even 30, 40 years ago, we didn't have anything like the sophistication of ice core sampling that we have today. And so with those changing technologies of perception and changing technologies of detection, new objects of study and new objects of awareness come to the fore. Okay? And so what I'm arguing here is that in addition to looking at a cross-section of time, we should also look at a cross-section of class, of wealth, because there are layers, different layers to who is having an impact and who is not. And so that any discussion of Homo sapiens as a hurtling chunk of rock, as a surrogate asteroid, should be broken down into big chunks of rock and pebbles, in a sense. They're having a very different impact on the viability of life on Earth. So it's a question of minding the gap between the ultra-rich and the mega-poor, and not generalizing out impacts. And I think an image that for me captures this very well is a Spanish street artist called Sam 3, who produced this image of Deep Rooted. And I was thinking about it in relation particularly to the surge of deforestation in the Amazon. And one of the things that I like about this image, or that moves me about it, is its capacity to link contemporary actions, surface actions, with deep time. And a deep time that is both biological and geological, so that you have the flow of life through the submerged body that is human, but also more than human. And in the image, you have the idea of the felling of the tree as a mindless surface act, as a kind of self-decapitation. And you have as you do in many, many cosmologies, the continuity of being between the tree and the human form. There's no clear-cut separation between human life and the forest. And so this is an image that requires us to read, in a sense, stratigraphically. And it looks at, as with an iceberg, the bulk of life that is hidden, the bulk of the object, hyper-object, if you like, is hidden beneath the surface, but surface acts that we choose to do in the present will have this long-term effect on times to come. Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you. Yeah, hi.
I was wondering, have you seen the photography book called Anthropocene?
No,